Good morning. My name is Superintendent David Hall, and I am the officer in charge of the Alberta RCMP Serious Crimes Branch. The Serious Crimes Branch is responsible for providing specialized investigative services and support in a range of serious criminal investigations across the province. In particular, the branch investigates all homicides occurring within RCMP jurisdiction throughout the province. We also have a dedicated historical homicide unit. We're announcing today that we have linked 4 previously unsolved historic homicides from the 1970s to a now deceased serial sexual offender. Further, the Alberta RCMP believe that this offender may be responsible for more unsolved homicides and sexual assaults in Western Canada. In 1976, Eva Dvorak and Patricia McQueen, Patsy as she preferred, were both 14, living in Calgary, attending junior high. The teenagers were friends, spending time together both in and out of school. On the late evening of February 14, 1976, Eva and Patsy were last seen walking together in downtown Calgary. The following day, at approximately 10:40 a.m., their bodies were found laying on the road underneath the Happy Valley overpass on Highway 1, west of Calgary. In the spring of 1976, 20-year-old Melissa Rahorik moved to Calgary from Ontario with the hope of new opportunities. At the time of her death, Melissa was employed as a housekeeper, living at the YWCA in downtown Calgary. Melissa was last seen on the evening of September 15, 1976, by a roommate. She had intended on hitchhiking out of the city during her days off. The following day, at approximately 10:50 a.m., her body was located in the ditch on what is now known as Township Road 252, approximately 22 kilometers west of Calgary. In 1977, Barbara McLean was a 19-year-old Calgary resident. Originally from Nova Scotia, Barbara had moved to Calgary only 6 months prior and was working at a local bank. On February 25, 1977, Barbara attended the Highlander Hotel Bar in Calgary with friends, and she was last seen walking alone away from the hotel in the early morning hours of February 26. Approximately 6 hours later, Barbara's body was discovered in the area of 6th Street and 80th Avenue Northeast, Calgary. At the time, this location was outside of the Calgary city limits. Autopsies were conducted on all 4 victims, and initially the medical examiner was unable to determine the cause of death for Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen. Consequently, their deaths were not ruled as homicides, but were investigated as suspicious deaths, though to be clear, these investigations were never closed. Both Melissa Rahorik and Barbara McLean's cause of death was attributed to strangulation. Both of these deaths were investigated as homicides, and their files were never closed. Exhibits seized from all 4 victims were submitted to the RCMP's National Forensic Laboratory Services for testing. Although seminal fluid was discovered at all 3 crime scenes on all 4 victims, technology at the time did not exist to develop a profile of DNA. From the onset, similarities between Melissa Rahorik and Barbara McLean's deaths led investigators to believe that the same person was responsible for both homicides. For nearly 50 years, the Alberta RCMP exhausted all investigational means in an attempt to identify the person responsible for these tragic deaths. The files were continually reassessed, with investigators following all leads that they could. The initial investigations lasted into the 1980s, and in the 1990s, no less than 4 task forces were created to re-examine evidence, tips from the public, and any lead not previously followed. In the 2000s, advancements in technology were applied. In total, for all investigations, nearly 800 tips were received and investigated, and in the hopes of identifying a suspect, approximately 500 statements or inquiries were completed with members of the public. 853 suspects or persons of interest were identified, where investigators used varying police techniques available at the time to either include or exclude them from the investigation. 1,490 vehicles were identified and investigated with the hope of identifying the one belonging to the actual suspect. And no less than 70 RCMP officers were directly involved as field investigators over the years. In 2003, with the advancement of enhanced DNA analysis, police were finally able to confirm through a DNA match that the same suspect was in fact linked to both Melissa Rehorick and Barbara McLean's murders. At the time, the suspect's DNA was compared against the National DNA Databank without a match. The profile was uploaded into the databank and went without a hit for over 20 years. When the tool known as investigative genetic genealogy became available, the Alberta RCMP were hopeful they could identify the unknown DNA contributor linked to Melissa and Barbara's murders. And in 2021, the RCMP and Calgary Police Service formed a true partnership to use investigative genetic genealogy to successfully identify the suspect. RCMP investigators re-examined the exhibits that they had seized over 45 years ago, and they worked with the RCMP's National Forensic Laboratory Services and a private DNA company, Parabon Nanolabs, to develop a DNA profile that was, in turn, uploaded to the public domain DNA services, which allows for information sharing with law enforcement within their terms of service. Genealogists from Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy, contracted by the Calgary Police Service, were able to start building a family tree based on the DNA profile, while detectives from the Calgary Police Service Homicide Cold Case Unit were professionally tenacious in completing target testing to drive the genealogy portion to a conclusion. This is in and of itself an extensive process. When target testing was complete, Convergence IGG was able to provide a suspect hypothesis. For the first time, investigators finally had the name of a viable suspect, one that had never surfaced in the investigation before. However, the hypothesis still needed to be confirmed. Analytical queries confirmed the suspect's connection to Canada and that he had a criminal record of committing violent acts upon women. During this same time, crime scene evidence was resubmitted to the RCMP Forensic Lab from the Dvorak and McQueen investigation. The same unknown male DNA profile was identified on both victims, and it was confirmed that this DNA profile also matched the male DNA located in the Melissa and Barbara's murders. In light of this new information, the RCMP believes that the same male offender was responsible for the deaths of all 4 victims, and that Eva and Patsy had in fact been murdered. The RCMP, using the information provided through the genetic genealogy process, began a cross-border investigation into a United States citizen, Gary Allen Serreri, born in 1942. It was quickly learned that Serreri died of natural causes in an Idaho state prison in 2011 while serving a life sentence for sexual assault. With assistance from Interpol and the Idaho State Police Forensic Services, Serreri's DNA was confirmed as a match to the unknown male DNA profile present on all 4 of our young victims. Due to the forensic evidence, witness statements, and similar fact evidence, the Alberta RCMP believe that Gary Allen Serreri is responsible for the murders of Patsy McQueen, Eva Dvorak, Melissa Rehorick, and Barbara McLean. Were Serreri alive today, he would be 81 years old and would be charged with the following offenses: 2 counts of non-capital murder on Eva Dvorak and Patricia McQueen, and 1 count of first-degree murder on Melissa Rehorick, and 1 count on Barbara McLean. These different charges reflect changes to the criminal code in the 1970s. For nearly 50 years, investigators did not give up in their pursuit to identify the man responsible for these murders. Identifying the offender does not bring back Eva, Patsy, Melissa, or Barbara. It is my true hope that their families are finally able to have some answers as to what happened to their loved ones all those years ago. The RCMP would like to thank the Calgary Police Service and Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy for their assistance and support throughout the course of this investigation. Forming these partnerships was the catalyst that helped bring this investigation to a close.
Good morning. My name is Inspector Brianne Brown. I am the Provincial Operations Support Officer for the Alberta RCMP Serious Crimes Branch, and can speak briefly about how we have learned about Gary Allen Serreri. Through the background investigation into Sweary, members of the Alberta RCMP Historical Homicide Unit were able to establish the following. Gary Sweary was a U.S. citizen who was residing illegally in Canada at the time of the murders. Prior to coming to Calgary, Sweary had already obtained an extensive criminal record in the United States for sex-related offenses, including forcible rape, kidnapping, burglary, and what was then known as sexual perversion. Sweary fled from the U.S. sometime during 1974 after posting bail for a rape charge in California. He lived under the aliases in Calgary in 1976 and 1977 that included, but were not limited to, Willie Blackman and Rex Long. He used at least 9 different aliases during his lifetime. While in Canada in the 70s and 80s, Sweary was able to illegally obtain provincial identification and was able to register for social assistance with these aliases. He lived a transient lifestyle and worked occasionally under the table as a cook. He never maintained any close male relationships during his lifetime in Canada. Sweary was adept to frequently changing his appearance, his place of residence, and his vehicles. Through investigation, RCMP believed that Sweary was living in Calgary between the years of 1975 and 1979. In 1979 and onwards, Sweary is believed to have lived in the Lower Mainland, Sunshine Coast, and the Fraser Valley areas of British Columbia. In 1998, he was convicted of a sexual assault in New Westminster, British Columbia, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After completing his sentence, he was deported back to the United States in 2003. Sweary was again convicted for sexually motivated crime in Idaho, was sentenced to life in prison, and died while incarcerated in 2011. We know that Sweary's criminality spanned decades over multiple jurisdictions and numerous aliases. The Alberta RCMP believe there will be more victims. We are asking the public to assist in further establishing Sweary's timeline in Canada. It is particularly concerning that Sweary appears to have no meaningful contact with law enforcement agencies within Canada since he illegally entered the country in the mid-1970s. Until he was arrested, charged, and convicted for the New Westminster assault in 1998. At present time, while we are cognizant of Sweary's known timeline in Alberta up to 1979, the Alberta RCMP have not associated him to any other unsolved homicides, either through forensic evidence or witness accounts. If you recognize Gary Sweary or knew him by one of his many aliases, the Alberta RCMP want to hear from you. Photographs of Sweary, his varied appearances, aliases, and vehicles will be made available to the public. For tips and information on Sweary, please contact the Alberta RCMP Historical Homicide Unit. We will be posting an email address, and the phone number is 780-509-3306. Eva, Patsy, Melissa, and Barbara, you have never been forgotten, and your memories will live with us forever. To the loved ones, families, and friends of other unsolved homicide victims, the Alberta RCMP would like to assure you that no case is ever closed and that investigators are tirelessly invested in pushing these investigations forward with the advancement of new technology, partnerships, and new information. Thank you.
Gendarme, en français, s'il vous plaît.
I'd just like to say a final thank you to absolutely everyone involved in pushing to advance these investigations between 1976 and 2024. Some of our investigators have passed, some have retired, and some remain on active duty. We've been in contact with each of the victims' families over the years as new information is developed, and each family extends a sincere personal thank you for your dedication and efforts. The entirety of their letters of appreciation will be made available as well. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the dedication of the members of the Alberta RCMP Historical Homicide Unit. The tenacity needed to bring conclusion to files which have remained unsolved for decades cannot be understated. Had it not been for their professionalism and commitment, these exhibits would never have been reanalyzed, the offender's name never known, nor the investigation completed. No investigation, no matter how successful, can undo the harm caused by crimes of this nature. The tireless dedication, however, of all employees of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and our partners allows us to bring answers to the families of the 4 young women robbed of their features. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent.